should you be changing the oil in your freeze dryer mid-cycle? That's exactly what we're going to be talking about in today's freeze-dried episode. Thanks a lot for joining me, folks. My name is Eric with Two Guys in a Cooler. Let's get into it. The oil that your vacuum pump uses for your freeze dryer literally influences a lot of the freeze drying processes. The amount of time that it takes for you to freeze dry food, for instance, is influenced by the oil in your vacuum pump. The shelf temperature that the food is drying on is influenced by oil in the vacuum pump. Even the vacuum pressure, your chamber pressure, your millitor, is influenced by the oil in your vacuum pump. If you have clean oil, fresh oil, free from debris, your vacuum pump is going to run at its most efficient. Your food's going to freeze dry faster and a lot more evenly. But if your oil in the vacuum pump has a lot of debris, if it has a lot of moisture, that efficiency goes down. Your food is going to take longer to freeze dry, and you might end up having a problem with your vacuum pump. All right, let's just get the obvious question out of the way. How often should you change the oil in your vacuum pump? Well, every manufacturer is going to tell you something different, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to the quality of the pump, and on some level, the quality of the oil. Lower quality pumps, for instance, the oil needs to be changed more frequently. Higher quality pumps, you can run more cycles, generally 30 or 40 cycles, without having to change the oil. I will tell you this, changing the oil more frequently is never a bad idea. Hypothetically speaking, if you change the oil in your lower or higher quality pump after every single batch that you freeze dried, you will more than likely never experience a problem with your vacuum pump. With that being said, there are a few signs that either your freeze dryer or your vacuum pump will tell you that lets you know you need to change the oil immediately. And if you get any of these signs through your freeze drying process, I would shut the system down and change the oil mid-cycle. Matter of fact, we're going to be doing it. I'm going to show you how I do it here in a second with the Stay Fresh freeze dryer. But let me go over what some of those signs are. The first is probably the most obvious. It's the sight glass. If you notice that the sight glass on your vacuum pump is extraordinarily cloudy, or even if it looks like it has debris or gunk of any kind of color inside that sight glass, I would shut the process down immediately and then change the oil. So that's probably the easiest and most obvious sign. Another sign that your freeze dryer is going to give you that you should stop what you're doing and change the oil immediately, even if it's mid-batch, is if your freeze drying cycle is taking a lot longer than it should. Hopefully you've been freeze drying now for quite some time and you're taking notes and you have a relatively good understanding as to how long a batch runs. I know that when I put 40 or 50 pounds in the Mega, it takes anywhere between 48 to 50 hours depending on what I'm doing. Or if I put 16 to 18 pounds in the Stay Fresh Standard, I know that it takes, X amount of time. Well, if all of a sudden I start to realize that I'm running into that 60-hour or 70-hour mark, and I'm not really in the final stages of freeze drying, then that's letting me know that I have a problem. I'll shut the unit down and change the oil. And then as soon as I add the new oil and start the unit back up, immediately everything is corrected. It's absolutely amazing. A third sign that your freeze dryer will give you is if all of a sudden you see the chamber millitor, the chamber pressure spike and the shelf temperature plummet. So let's say you're hovering around 300 millitor, 500 millitor, and that's kind of where you're at. And it really just depends on the brand, but this kind of goes across the board for any brand. No matter where your millitor is, if you're towards the end of the drying cycle, that number should just be getting lower, okay? Depending on what brand you have, it will determine how low it gets, but it should never increase. And so if all of a sudden you see that 500 millitor spike to, let's say, 1200 or 1500, and you notice the shelf temperature plummet and it starts to read at 30 degrees or even negative 10 degrees or whatever that number is, you've got a major problem there, and it usually has to do with the quality of the oil. You should stop the process, change the oil immediately, and then as soon as you add new oil, you're going to be blown away as to how it instantly fixes the problem. And so those are three pretty telling signs that your freeze dryer or your vacuum pump will let you know right off the bat, hey, it's time to change your oil. So what causes the oil to get so dirty so quick? Enough so where you have to change it mid-cycle, otherwise it could either ruin your pump or delay the freeze drying cycle, making it very inefficient. This is an example of what some oil looks like coming out of one of our freeze dryers. We put brand new fresh oil when the freeze drying cycle started, and about 36 hours, 40 hours into it, this is what it looked like. All of a sudden, my Militor spiked, the temperature of our shelves plummeted, and I realized that we had a problem. As soon as I changed the oil, I saw what the problem was. Just take a look at it. I mean, check that out. We've got a lot of water here at the bottom, a lot of solids, a lot of debris. Notice how cloudy and dirty the oil is. So what causes that? Well, there's a couple reasons that your oil can get this dirty this quick. And one, in my opinion, is the most obvious, and that's just simply overloading your freeze dryer. Every freeze dryer has what they call an ice holding capacity, and that's the amount of ice that the chamber can hold, the amount of ice that can stick to the wall. When you reach your ice holding capacity, the water vapor that's coming off your food will no longer stick to the wall, but instead will get sucked into the vacuum line and ending up condensing inside of your oil. Water inside of your oil makes your vacuum pump run really inefficient. It causes the vacuum components inside to begin rusting, which later can be problematic. Another reason that this could happen is if you put food into your freeze dryer and it's not completely frozen. Any food that you put into your freeze dryer, with the exception of candy, should be at least 0 degrees Fahrenheit. -5 or lower is better. Because you got to remember, as soon as that vacuum pump kicks on and the pressure inside that chamber begins to drop, that water begins to boil. If it's frozen, it's in a solid state. And when it starts to boil in a solid state, it skips over the liquid state and goes directly to a gas or a vapor. That's called sublimation. But if it's not completely frozen, when that vacuum pump kicks on, that liquid begins to boil and you start to get a lot of moisture into your chamber, hence water inside your vacuum line. And you definitely don't want to do that. The third reason I think something like this could happen comes down to the settings of your freeze dryer. There are certain manufacturers of freeze dryers that allow you to manipulate the chamber pressure or the Militor before the cycle even begins. Now, personally, I love this feature. It offers a ton of flexibility. It allows you to do things a little bit slower, a little more delicate, or a little bit faster, but it's only good if you know how to use it. Let me give you an example. Let's say your Militor is by default set to 500. And you wanted to freeze dry something a little more delicate, let's say flowers, for instance. You could lower the Militor at the beginning of the cycle to something like 250. And what you're in essence doing is you're telling the algorithm you want the cycle to run through its steps a little bit slower. And so it's going to take you longer to get to your final target temperature. In essence, freeze drying a little more slowly. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, you can increase the Militor. And when you increase the Militor, so let's say you're operating at 500 and you increase it to 800 or 1,000, what you're doing in that case is you're telling the algorithm you want to get to your target temperature a lot faster. The only downside to increasing the Militor is because you're rushing the process, depending on the amount of moisture that's in your food, you could end up with a lot of moisture in the oil, which obviously it's not good, but if you catch it when it's happening, you could change the oil and you can move on. Not a big deal. The last thing that could cause this, I think, there may be others, but these seem like the big four, the ones that come to mind at least, is if you happen to be freeze drying in a room that's incredibly hot, or you have multiple freeze dryers right next to each other, they generate a lot of heat, and you don't have adequate ventilation. The reason this could be a problem is because the process of freeze drying requires that the chamber temperature, the wall of the drum inside your freeze dryer, gets down to very cold temperatures, -20, -30, -40 in some circumstances. And if you're trying to freeze dry in a room that's very warm, or if the area around the compressor is very warm, it's going to have a very difficult time getting to those sub-zero temperatures. And as the cooling system in the freeze dryer struggles to get down to these very low temperatures, the freeze dryer itself is not going to be very efficient at capturing the water vapor that's being released from the food. And if it's not capturing the water vapor, then that water vapor is being sucked into the vacuum line along with, debris and particles, and that's going to also end up into your vacuum pump. We're going to go in the other room, and I'm going to show you how I change the oil mid-cycle on the Stay Fresh Mega. Here's our Stay Fresh Mega. We're doing a batch of bone meal and collagen for the dog food, and check out the ice ring that we have in here. Definitely overloaded it. I think we have probably 55 pounds of material in there. And some of it was incredibly wet, especially the collagen. And so I'm noticing the batch taking longer than it should. So let's go to the control panel and let me just show you what I do to stop the process mid-cycle. Don't pay attention to the times on the screen. We had a power outage and the unit restarted. Okay, so to pause the drying mid-cycle, we're going to press the drying button. It's going to ask us if we want to pause drying. We're going to click yes, and immediately the vacuum pump's going to turn off, but the compressor is going to stay on. Back here in the back, an automatic ball valve is going to close, and that's going to keep your chamber under vacuum. Now, not all freeze dryers have this feature, but the Stay Fresh does. We do not need to release the vacuum in this particular case. All we need to do is begin to remove the oil. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove the oil from this demister. Notice it's a little bit shadowy right there in the bottom inch. Since we're going to be changing the oil, I might as well remove that oil anyway. And to do that, all we're going to do is place a little cup under the drain spout and open it up. The thing about the oil coming from the demister is that it's a combination of oil, because you got oil mist, and water vapor. And so all I'm going to be doing is emptying this. I'm not going to be adding that back into the, vacuum pump. We're going to set that to the side. On occasion, you might want to tilt your vacuum pump so that you can get as much out as possible. But if you don't get it all the way out, it doesn't really matter all that very much. Let's close it down, and now let's look at changing the oil. So this is what we're looking at. We're going to put a cup underneath the spigot, and the industrial pump doesn't come with a valve like that. I actually built this for the machine, and I'll put a video suggestion at the end of this video. We also need to take off the oil cap. That's going to allow the oil to flow more freely once we open it up. And then right here in the back, I've got an air shim. Let me put a light on it so you can see. And all we want to do with this air shim is tilt the pump forward. Now, you can prop the pump up with a piece of wood or something. It doesn't really matter. And once you have that, you can open up the pump. And notice the water coming out right off the bat. That's the first thing that I'm seeing. A lot of water coming out of that pump and dirty oil. Now we're starting to see a little bit more of that oil, but it's very cloudy. It's got a lot of skunk in it, and yeah, definitely needed an oil change. All right, we're going to release the air shim, bring it all the way back. We're going to change out the cups, and I'm going to add a little bit more oil to the pump to give it a flush. That's all I'm doing right here. So basically, I'm adding clean oil to the pump, and then I'm going to drain it once again, and that's going to flush whatever's inside of that pump. And as you'll see, it's still incredibly dirty. So it's definitely worth flushing at least once with clean oil. At this point, once we're done, I'm now going to add fresh oil back into the machine, and we're going to make sure that we fill it up to about halfway. No problem. Close the oil cap. And now back to the home screen on the Stay Fresh menu. At this point, you're just going to press the drying button to reactivate it. And then a menu is going to pop up. Just read through that menu, make sure everything is good, and then hit the yes option if everything's great. And your valve will open up. The pump will continue drying. Notice that we lost very little pressure inside that cabin. Perfect. Now let's take a look at the oil that we drained. So this is the first cup from the mid-batch. Notice it's very, very cloudy. A lot of material in there, a lot of water in there, and that's more than likely why the cycle was taking so long. You also have a lot of debris floating around inside that oil, and none of that is good for trying to pull a really great vacuum. Now, if I let that sit on my counter for a few days, the debris will settle to the bottom and get trapped in that water layer right there. And at that point, you can either filter it or you can dispose of it and just put new fresh oil into your machine. This is round number 2. This was the flush. Notice that we still had a lot of dirty oil remaining, probably coating the inside of that pump. It's totally worth doing a second, even a third flush if you can, but I generally only do about 2 flushes. And once again, if you want to let that sit on the counter, that will clean up a little bit, and then you can either filter it or you can dispose it. Let's take a look at the oil from the demister. And we didn't have a lot of oil in there, but notice there's a little bit of water right there at the very bottom. And that's not unusual for the demister. Matter of fact, that's kind of the purpose of the demister. And so what I'll do here is I'll put a cap on that cup and just continue to pull the oil-water mixture from the demister until it's full, at which point I'll filter it, excluding the water. And so that's normally what I do with that. Let me show you some oil from another batch that I ran, different freeze dryer. So this right here is what we just pulled from our Mega just now. And this here came from a totally different freeze dryer. Completely different issue, matter of fact. But notice we still have very cloudy, very dirty oil, a little bit of water, not as much water in this particular oil, but the freeze dryer gave me a spike in millitorr, and the temperature of the shelf dropped to something like 30 degrees. And this was after 40 hours of freeze drying. And so that was one of the indicators. As soon as I saw it, I immediately stopped the process, changed the oil, gave it a flush, put in new oil, and it immediately fixed the problem. All right, guys, oil in the vacuum pump for your freeze dryer. Incredibly important conversation. We don't really talk about it all that much, but if you happen to have a freeze dryer, huge investments you want to pay attention to the oil and how often you change it. And regardless of what the manufacturer says, changing the oil more frequently is never a bad thing. Matter of fact, I would argue you're actually doing better for your machine if you change it more frequently. We have industrial pumps for our Stay Fresh, and they're rated to go between 30 and 40 cycles before you have to change the oil. Honestly, I probably change the oil every 4 to 5 cycles. Now for me, draining the oil is super easy. As you saw in this video, we added a valve that allows me to just open it, drain the oil, and then add new oil. The whole process takes honestly less than 2 minutes. If you would like to see how we added that drain valve to the industrial pump, I'll put a video suggestion for you right about here. All right, guys, if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. And if you're in the market for a freeze dryer, I invite you to check out the Stay Fresh. They're absolutely incredible machines built like tanks. I'll put a link to their company in the description box below, as well as a discount code that'll help you save a couple bucks off your purchase. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you are new to this channel and you enjoy this type of content, hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. Thanks a lot for being here. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.